Alright, so I kind of want to have a discussion at this point about a couple of things that I've been thinking about. And the basic title of this video, Philosophy of Sex and the Human Condition, is something that's very interesting to me. But I just want to discuss the philosophy of sex, or the philosophy of sexuality, as it is in the applied philosophy sense, or the applied ethics sense. If we look at that sort of category of applied ethics or applied philosophy, that is something that talks about the concept of sexuality, or the concept of sexual identity, issues of gender, ethics of the phenomena, or kind of talking about stuff like rape, harassment, and this kind of goes deep into like feminism and feminist philosophies, talking about philosophers like Simone de Beauvoir. Like, she has a good amount of writings that are feminist driven, and Judith Butler as well. She's someone I really want to get into at some point. She has some really amazing works that I need to get into. I've probably only read one of her books, honestly, but the way that I've been thinking about this is in a different sense, I guess. I've been thinking about sex and love, I guess, and the human condition in that way, and how the concept of sex and what sex is, the way sex should be, and the way that has been used to harm people in different ways. And thinking about that has kind of been something I've been really thinking about quite a lot, and thinking about that in terms of my own experiences, and thinking about it in terms of experiences of others. Thinking about it in terms of Paulo Freire in his book, the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I don't know how many people know about this book these days. The only reason I know about it is because of a professor by the name of Jason J. Campbell, who used to do big lectures on YouTube of notable philosophy books. And he did some big lectures on this book. He's still on YouTube, but he hasn't done that in a long time. Basically, just to kind of go into this book a little bit, he talks about how he discusses the idea of oppression, as to how a group of people, or a person, or kind of person in general, can oppress another group or another person and subjugate them, and that basically can be oppressing somebody else, and how in that person being oppressed, once that person has I guess you call it the upper hand, would basically end up oppressing somebody else in turn, and how there's this vicious cycle of oppression. And it kind of reminds me of a man and a woman, and how that can happen quite a lot, and how it does happen quite a lot. Looking at it from the feminist perspective, and now as far as feminism goes today, I don't like it at all. I don't like how feminism brings to a woman this sense of entitlement, as to how men owe them everything, as to how men need to give a woman everything, and how a man owes a woman everything because of things that may have happened to her, or because of her status as a woman. So the effects of that philosophy today and in the past is not good. However, looking at it in more of its roots and its philosophical beginnings is a better way that I would like to look at it, and looking at feminism in a good light. And there's because the truth is that men, in their relationships with women, have oppressed oppress women, whether it be by rape, whether it be by harassment, whether it be by a man and a woman being in a relationship and there being a battered woman syndrome there, um, about how a man can oppress a woman in that way, and him having power over her physically, um, stuff like that, which does happen. It does happen quite a lot, and some people would look at that happening way more than the other side of it. And in the past, as in like the before the 20th century and before the late 20th century and 21st century, that's kind of what happened. Women were in a state where, like before the 60s and 70s, a woman was a person who stayed at home, who did housework, was a person who would get pregnant and take care of the kids, and the man was in a state of absolute power, and that's kind of the way it was. Granted, you do have your exceptions even in those times, but that's kind of how it was. And during World War II and in the 60s, the women did have times of when they would come to power themselves. There came a time when a woman wasn't just a person who cooked and cleaned and took care of the kids, and was a person who was just there to get pregnant and to have kids and to please her man. That wasn't always the case. I mean, it was the case, but now it's not. Since those times, a woman has become someone who is very often the breadwinner now, where before it was just the man who would bring home bacon and make money for the family. Whereas following the 60s and 70s, women became a gender that did have power and did bring home money and did have jobs, same as men. And that kind of was a big change in history. It was a big change. And basically now, in the past, however many years, it has become a state where the woman has also, just like Freire said, is in this vicious cycle of oppression, has found herself in a place where she can definitely oppress man as well. Whether that be looking at that is kind of looking at it from the movement called the MGTOW, or men going their own way. And that is kind of a movement where a man is not going to be at the beck and call of a woman, isn't going to do whatever a woman says, and is going to basically go his own way. And there are various videos of that on YouTube. If you look up the word MGTOW, there are various videos of people who definitely abide by that. I would say I would definitely include myself in that group. Honestly, I don't see myself ever being in a relationship again unless I saw basically a large reason to. Because the way I look at it is that the only reason I would want to be in any kind of relationship or marriage or whatever is the only case in which that relationship or marriage would be a situation when both myself and this person would be both people who loved each other and were there for each other, and not for money or any other reason. Not for money, not for sexual reasons or for each other because of the love that we each have. That, I think, is a thing that doesn't happen as much as it may or may not have used to. And that's kind of interesting. And that's kind of what has got me thinking about this. And this made me think about Freire and about Foucault. Foucault has a series of volumes called the history of sex, and that I haven't read those books in a very long time, and I have those books. I have started the first one again. I need to reread that and then do videos on this channel about that. But there's a lot of discussion in those books about power and knowledge and the idea of repression, and he does also discuss oppression, talking about how in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, there was this idea of sexuality, which a person having a quote unquote sexuality was not really something that was thought about or discussed then, and how sex was kind of was repressed, it was taboo, and he goes into discussing that whole thing. How he goes into discussing sex and sexuality itself, I guess. I mean, that's kind of, it's really is a really good book, I would say. But what I'm interested in thinking about and talking about is as to how sex and sexuality affects people, and how it affects us, and how that itself can be used to oppress another. As to how a man can use sex to oppress a woman, and how a woman can use sex to oppress a man, and I kind of have looked at relationships and sex via the MGTOW perspective, as to how a relationship, unless it's the genuine form that I discussed earlier, it's basically is a it is a transaction, just like buying food or beer at the store. It's a woman saying, "I will give you companionship. I will give you a facade of love, basically. I will give you sex, and I will give you a companion who will feed you, who will make food for you, take care of your kids, and be any kind of woman that you want me to be, if you do this, and this for me," which can include basically lots of times it's money. It's money to buy things. It's a roof over her head. It's money to do what she wants with, and it isn't stated as just that. It's it's basically veiled to look like a real genuine thing at times, but it basically is just a transaction. And the way I've looked at it, the way I look at it is that when man makes this transaction, and he gives her this money, this roof over her head, and all this stuff, he doesn't get back what he paid for, I guess, and he is oppressed by saying, unless you do this, no more sex. Unless you do this, I will divorce you and take everything you have, stuff like that. And in those ways, in ways of divorce, taking your kids away, taking your money away via alimony, or all this kinds of legal things that a woman has power over a man in a situation of a divorce. That is, there are many ways that I'm saying there are many ways that a woman can oppress a man. Same as it is the other way around. There are this vicious cycle of oppression that surrounds this whole idea of sex and sexuality, and also this whole notion of love, which is also loosely tied to this. The philosophy of love is a whole different thing, and is another topic. However, that is loosely connected to this. And I say loosely because the notion of love is something that I think is vague. I think it's difficult to pin down, difficult to understand as to what that means, and even more difficult to actually find once you have defined it. You know, and looking at Marx, I want to say something about Marx for a second. Foucault does look at it from the Marxist standpoint about how capitalism has a part in this. Marx and his division of labor, his whole Marxist thought process goes into this whole thing of sex and how that can oppress you as well. Marx talks about how when you are given a job, when you are said that if you do this work, you'll be given competition for that. You'll be given money for it. Money, which means food. It means a roof over your head. It means water. It means power. It means whatever. The work that in Marx's times that often meant working 14 hours a day or more in a factory, which had low safety standards. It had low everything. You were basically working in a factory for 14 hours to barely put a roof over your head, to barely feed your family. And how Marx argued that in that state there is a alienation from yourself, because you're basically yourself is being put into this factory or this work, which you have no other choice but to do. In this whole division between bourgeoisie and the proletarian, which is very important as well. Foucault also discusses the bourgeoisie in the case of sex as well, and how basically in the 1700s and 1800s and early 20th century, how the whole idea of sex being repressed in this puritanized society of the bourgeois. But basically Marx and how he discussed the work and labor, and how labor and how when you have to do something in order to feed your family, to take care of yourself and your family, and how that work is not competition enough. It's not enough for you to be yourself, and how that alienates you from yourself, and almost how that's also a state of oppression via labor by the people who hold the means of production, and how that can be used to oppress workers. Same thing here as to how a man who like the whole transaction thing as to how a man says, I'll give you money, I'll put a roof over your head, I'll be the breadwinner, I would say, and how he isn't given back what he wanted. He is not given this lofty thought of love with the real person as he was thinking. He isn't given sex like he wanted. He isn't given companionship like he wanted, or like he was promised. And I think that in that state that a man or a woman can be in when they are in a marriage or a relationship, that also is a state of alienation from yourself. So I think it's very important to look at the human condition and as to how sex can play a very important part in that. So I'm going to be thinking about that and reading more of Foucault's History of Sex and thinking about same way as how Marx discussed labor and how labor can oppress you and alienate you. Same way as to how sex and being in a marriage or a relationship these days can do that to you as well. And that's very important. And basically looking at the human condition itself is very important to me. It's very important to me to think about and talk about the human condition. It's very important to me to think about those who discuss that being the existentialists, the feminists. I can't speak because I'm thinking more than I'm speaking. I'm thinking too fast, and I cannot get out words. Because what happens to me is when I think too quickly, I can't get the words out. That's very, very, very important to me. So, it's very important. It's very important to me to think about the human condition then, now, and in the future, and what can hurt a person, what can cause a person to be distraught, what can cause a person to be in a bad state, and what can cause a person to be in a good state. All these things are very important. It's important to think about the human condition and the human and just a person in general, past, present, and future, and what can change that, and what can all these different things that basically come into play when you think about humans, thinking about us.